Alexander Stone stepped out of his sleek black Bentley, barely glancing at the courthouse steps crowded with reporters. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the pavement as his security team formed a protective barrier around him. At 42, he had the confident stride of a man who believed the world existed to serve him. "Mr. Stone, do you have any comment on the allegations against your company?" a reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone toward him. Alexander didn't even bother to look in the reporter's direction. He simply adjusted his $10,000 suit jacket and kept walking. Behind his designer sunglasses, his eyes remained fixed on his smartphone, where he was checking the morning's stock prices. His company, Stone Innovations, had revolutionized the tech industry with its groundbreaking devices. The fact that some former employees were claiming unsafe working conditions in his factories seemed like nothing more than an annoying fly he needed to swat away. They should be grateful they even had jobs, he muttered to his lead attorney Diane Powell, who walked briskly beside him. "Remember what we discussed, Alex," Diane said quietly. "This judge doesn't tolerate disrespect in her courtroom. Judge Lucia Rivera has a reputation for being tough but fair." Alexander scoffed. "She's just another person who couldn't make it in the real business world, so she hides behind a government paycheck. Don't worry about it." Diane sighed. In the 15 years she had represented Alexander, his ego had grown alongside his fortune. What had started as healthy confidence had twisted into something ugly, a belief that rules simply didn't apply to him. Inside the courthouse, the security team peeled away as Alexander and his legal team made their way to courtroom 3B. The polished, wooden doors opened to reveal a room already half filled with people. The plaintiffs and their supporters on one side, curious onlookers and press representatives on the other. Alexander walked down the center aisle as if it were a runway designed specifically for him. He didn't acknowledge the group of former employees sitting together, the people whose complaints had brought him here. Among them was Robert Chen, who had lost 3 fingers in a machinery accident, and Alicia Patel, who had developed chronic respiratory problems after years of exposure to toxic chemicals. They watched him with a mixture of anger and disbelief at his casual demeanor. "The nerve of that man," Alicia whispered to Robert, "acting like he's attending a business lunch instead of facing people whose lives he ruined." Alexander settled into his chair at the defense table, immediately pulling out his phone again. Diane sat beside him, along with 2 junior attorneys, who spread documents across the table. "Put that away before the judge comes in," Diane whispered urgently. "I need to check on the Tokyo market," Alexander replied without looking up. "I'm about to lose millions because of this waste of time." The courtroom doors opened, and a hush fell over the room as the court clerk entered. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Lucia Rivera," the clerk announced in a clear, authoritative voice. Everyone in the courtroom stood. Everyone except Alexander Stone, who continued scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the tradition unfolding around him. Diane nudged him sharply. "Alex, stand up," she hissed. He glanced up briefly, taking in the sight of people on their feet, then deliberately returned his attention to his screen. "I don't stand for anyone," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Judge Rivera entered the courtroom with measured steps. At 58, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had fought hard for every achievement in her life. The daughter of immigrants who had cleaned houses and worked construction to put her through law school, she had spent 20 years on the bench, earning a reputation for fairness and insight. Her sharp eyes immediately noticed the seated figure at the defense table. If she was surprised by this show of disrespect, her expression didn't reveal it. Instead, she took her seat and nodded to the clerk. "You may be seated," the clerk announced. As rustling filled the courtroom, Judge Rivera adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Alexander Stone. "Mr. Stone," she said, her voice calm but carrying throughout the now silent courtroom. "Perhaps you didn't hear the clerk, or perhaps you're unfamiliar with courtroom protocol. When the judge enters, everyone rises as a sign of respect, not for me personally, but for the legal system we all depend on." Alexander finally looked up from his phone, an irritated expression crossing his face. "I heard," he said simply, not bothering to add "Your Honor" as protocol demanded. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Diane closed her eyes briefly, already calculating how to manage the damage her client was causing. Judge Rivera's expression remained neutral. "I see. Well, Mr. Stone, while you're in my courtroom, you will follow the same rules as everyone else. Your wealth does not exempt you from showing basic courtesy." Alexander's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way. Usually, people bent over backward to accommodate him, hoping for a scrap of his attention or influence. "Now," Judge Rivera continued, looking down at the papers before her, "we're here for the preliminary hearing in Stone Innovations. This is a case involving serious allegations about workplace safety and corporate negligence." She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "I want to be clear from the outset. In this courtroom, everyone will be treated equally, regardless of their financial status or position." As she spoke these words, her eyes lingered briefly on Alexander, who had returned to his phone beneath the table, clearly not listening. Diane kicked him under the table, and he looked up with an annoyed expression. "Mr. Stone," Judge Rivera said, "I would appreciate your full attention during these proceedings. They concern your company and serious allegations that, if proven true, would indicate you valued profits over human lives and safety." "These claims are ridiculous," Alexander said, finally slipping his phone into his pocket. "My company creates jobs and innovations that change the world. A few disgruntled ex-employees are trying to cash in with false claims." The plaintiffs, Attorney Thomas Washington, stood up. "Your Honor, Mr. Stone's dismissive attitude perfectly illustrates the culture of disregard for worker welfare that created these dangerous conditions in the first place." Judge Rivera nodded. "You'll have your chance to present your case, Mr. Washington. For now, let's proceed with the initial statements." As Thomas began outlining the case against Stone Innovations, Alexander leaned back in his chair with a bored expression. The attorney described factories where safety equipment was outdated or missing entirely, where workers who raised concerns were fired, and where injuries were commonplace but rarely reported because employees feared losing their jobs. Several times during this presentation, Alexander sighed loudly or shook his head in exaggerated disbelief, drawing disapproving glances from Judge Rivera. When it was Diane's turn to speak, she did her best to present their defense professionally, emphasizing the company's official safety policies and the billions in revenue it generated for the economy. Throughout her statement, Alexander continued his disruptive behavior, checking his watch repeatedly, shuffling papers unnecessarily, and at one point, even taking out a breath mint with exaggerated movements. After the opening statements, Judge Rivera called the first witness, Robert Chen. Robert walked slowly to the witness stand, the empty space where 3 fingers should have been clearly visible to everyone in the courtroom. After being sworn in, he began describing the night of his accident. The safety guard on the machine had been removed to increase production speed, he explained, his voice steady despite the painful memories. "I had reported this twice to my supervisor but was told to work faster or find another job." As Robert spoke, Alexander leaned toward Diane and whispered something that made her frown and shake her head. His dismissive smirk was noticed by everyone in the courtroom, including Judge Rivera. "Mr. Stone," the judge interrupted, "do you find something amusing about Mr. Chen's testimony about losing 3 fingers while working for your company?" Alexander straightened in his chair. "Not at all, Your Honor. I just find it convenient that he never mentioned these supposed safety concerns until after his accident." Robert's face flushed with anger. "I have emails," he said directly to Alexander. "I sent emails to the safety department. They were ignored." "Emails that could have been fabricated after the fact," Alexander replied with a wave of his hand. Judge Rivera's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Stone, you will not speak directly to witnesses and you will not make accusations without evidence. One more outburst like that, and I'll hold you in contempt." Alexander's face darkened at the reprimand. No one spoke to him that way. Not his board of directors, not his executives, and certainly not some judge in a county courthouse. As the morning progressed, Alexander's behavior grew increasingly disrespectful. He checked his phone under the table, whispered constantly to his attorneys, and made no effort to hide his disdain for the proceedings. When the court broke for lunch, Judge Rivera called both lead attorneys to her chambers. Her expression as they followed her suggested that the afternoon session would bring unexpected developments, ones that Alexander Stone, for all his wealth and power, was entirely unprepared for. What none of them realized was that Judge Rivera had dealt with powerful men like Alexander Stone before, and she had something planned that would shock not just the arrogant billionaire, but everyone in that courtroom. When court resumed after lunch, Alexander Stone walked in even later than everyone else, making a show of checking his expensive watch as if to suggest the court was wasting his precious time. Those watching closely noticed Judge Rivera's eyes follow him as he sauntered down the aisle, her expression unreadable but intense. "Nice of you to join us, Mr. Stone," Judge Rivera said as he took his seat. "I trust your lunch was worth delaying these proceedings for." Alexander simply shrugged and leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other in a posture that radiated indifference. His lead attorney, Diane, looked increasingly uncomfortable with each passing minute. "We'll continue with witness testimony," Judge Rivera announced. "The court calls Alicia Patel." Alicia made her way to the witness stand, walking with the slight limp that had developed after years of standing on concrete floors with inadequate support. At 36, she looked a decade older, her face lined with the strain of chronic pain and breathing problems. After being sworn in, Alicia began describing the conditions in the chemical processing area of Stone Innovation's main factory. "The ventilation systems were always breaking down," she explained, her voice occasionally interrupted by a wheezing cough. "When we complained, management would turn them on during inspections, then shut them off again to save money. We worked with toxic chemicals for 12-hour shifts with barely any protection." As she spoke, Alexander pulled out his phone again, scrolling through messages with obvious disinterest in her testimony. When Alicia described how her doctor had linked her lung damage directly to chemicals used in Stone's factories, Alexander let out an audible scoff. Judge Rivera's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Mr. Stone, put that phone away immediately." Alexander looked up, surprised by the forceful tone. For a moment he seemed ready to argue, but something in the judge's expression made him think better of it. He slipped the phone into his jacket pocket, but the smirk never left his face. "Please continue, Ms. Patel," the judge said gently. Alicia nodded gratefully. "After my diagnosis, I requested transfer to another department. My supervisor told me I should be grateful to have a job at all, and that plenty of people would take my place if I couldn't handle it." "And who was this supervisor?" Thomas Washington, the plaintiff's attorney, asked. "Gregory Phillips, the production manager. He reported directly to Mr. Stone." All eyes turned to Alexander, who was now doodling on a legal pad, drawing what appeared to be a sports car. "Ms. Patel," Thomas continued, "did Stone Innovations provide health insurance that covered your treatment?" Alicia shook her head. "They classified us as contract workers to avoid providing benefits. When I got sick, I lost everything paying. For treatments, my house, my savings, everything." Alexander's pen paused mid-stroke. "That's not my problem," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Judge Rivera's eyes flashed. "Mr. Stone, you are one comment away from being held in contempt. This is your final warning." Instead of looking chastened, Alexander merely rolled his eyes and returned to his doodling. As Alicia continued her testimony, she described how she had tried to organize workers to demand better conditions, only to be fired along with anyone who supported her. "They said it was for performance issues, but it happened the day after we submitted our petition for better safety equipment." "And do you have documentation of this petition?" Thomas asked. "Yes," Alicia replied, her voice stronger now. "I have the original document with 26 signatures and emails showing I sent it to Human Resources and to Mr. Stone's office directly." At the mention of direct evidence, Alexander finally looked up, a flicker of concern crossing his face for the first time. He leaned over to whisper urgently to Diane, who shook her head and wrote something on her notepad. Thomas approached the bench with a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter this into evidence. It's the safety petition Ms. Patel referenced, along with email receipts showing it was delivered to Mr. Stone's personal office email." Judge Rivera examined the document, then nodded. "Accepted." as Exhibit C. I receive hundreds of emails a day, Alexander said loudly without being addressed. My assistants handle most of them. I never saw any petition. Mr. Stone, Judge Rivera said sharply, you have not been asked to testify. Please refrain from speaking out of turn. As Thomas continued questioning Alicia, the pattern became clear. Stone Innovations had systematically prioritized profit over worker safety, creating a culture where employees were treated as disposable. Throughout this damning testimony, Alexander alternated between looking bored and annoyed, his body language conveying that he felt above the proceedings. When Thomas finished his questioning, Diane stood for cross-examination. Despite being a skilled attorney, she struggled to undermine Alicia's testimony without appearing callous about her obvious health problems. Ms. Patel, Diane began, isn't it possible that your respiratory issues could have been caused by factors outside the workplace? Do you smoke, for instance? I've never smoked a day in my life, Alicia replied firmly, and my doctor specifically identified chemicals used in Stone Innovations' manufacturing process as the cause. But you can't prove definitively that. I can, Alicia interrupted. My blood tests showed elevated levels of the same chemicals we worked with daily. It's all in my medical records, which were submitted to the court. Alexander shifted in his seat, looking increasingly uncomfortable as his company's negligence became harder to deny. He leaned forward and wrote something on a slip of paper, sliding it to Diane. She read it, frowned, and discreetly shook her head. No further questions, Diane said, returning to her seat. Judge Rivera called a 15-minute recess. As people filed out of the courtroom, Alexander remained seated, furiously typing on his phone. Diane stayed beside him, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. This is going badly, she told him. That petition going directly to your email is a problem. We need to consider settlement options. Alexander's face hardened. I'm not giving these people a cent, they're nobody. I create jobs, I drive innovation, I change the world. They're just workers who couldn't cut it. Alex, please, Diane pleaded. A jury will crucify you if they hear you talk like that. These people have real injuries, documented safety violations, and evidence that complaints went straight to you. So what? Alexander snapped. I'll appeal any verdict. I'll drag this out until they give up or die waiting for their money. I've got better lawyers than they could ever afford. Neither of them noticed the court reporter who had returned early to adjust her equipment, overhearing every word of their conversation. When court resumed, Judge Rivera seemed different, more focused, with an intensity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She watched Alexander carefully as he once again failed to rise when she entered the courtroom. The next witness was a former safety inspector for Stone Innovations, Luis Hernandez. His testimony was perhaps the most damaging, yet, as he described being ordered to falsify safety reports and how his recommendations for improvements were repeatedly ignored, I was told directly that safety measures beyond the bare minimum required by law were unnecessary expenses, Luis testified. When I pushed back, pointing out that people were getting hurt, I was moved to a different department and eventually laid off during a so-called restructuring. And who gave you these directives? Thomas asked. Luis looked directly at Alexander. Mr. Stone himself during a factory tour 3 years ago. When I showed him areas that needed safety improvements, he said, and I quote, "If they want better conditions, they should work harder and become the boss instead of complaining." Alexander leapt to his feet. That's a lie. I don't even remember this man. Mr. Stone, Judge Rivera's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip. Sit down immediately. This is ridiculous, Alexander continued, ignoring her. This is nothing but a shakedown by lazy workers looking for a payday from a successful company. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. The plaintiffs, many bearing visible injuries from their time at Stone's factories, looked stunned at his callousness. Order! Judge Rivera brought her gavel down repeatedly. Mr. Stone, you are in contempt of court. Alexander finally fell silent, but remained standing, glaring at the judge with open hostility. Since you prefer to stand now, Mr. Stone, you can remain standing, Judge Rivera said icily. "Bailiff, please approach the bench." The courtroom watched in tense silence as the judge whispered something to the bailiff, who nodded and left quickly through a side door. "This court will take a 30-minute recess," Judge Rivera announced. "When we return, I will address Mr. Stone's contempt and how we will proceed from here." As people filed out, whispers filled the air. Alexander remained at the defense table, huddled with his legal team, who looked increasingly concerned about their client's behavior and the judge's response. "What's the worst she can do?" Alexander asked dismissively. "Fine me? I'll write a check right now." Diane shook her head gravely. "Alex, she could actually send you to jail for contempt, and your behavior is destroying any sympathy the court might have had for our side." Alexander waved away her concerns. "She wouldn't dare. Do you know how many people I employ in this district? How much tax revenue my company generates? She's just putting on a show." But as the bailiff returned with a thick folder that he handed to Judge Rivera, and as the judge spent the entire recess reading through its contents with growing interest, those who observed closely could see that something unexpected was brewing, something that would shatter Alexander Stone's confidence and change the course of the case in ways no one could predict. When the court reconvened after the recess, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Everyone rose as Judge Rivera entered, everyone except Alexander Stone, who remained defiantly seated despite Diane's urgent whispers to stand up. "Still making your point, Mr. Stone?" Judge Rivera asked, her voice calm but edged with steel as she took her seat. "Very well. Let's address your contempt of court before we continue." She opened the folder the bailiff had brought her and adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Stone, I've spent the last 30 minutes reviewing some very interesting documents. Would you like to know what I found?" Alexander shrugged, the gesture calculated to appear casual, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. "If it pleases the court," he said with thinly veiled sarcasm. "Oh, it pleases me greatly," Judge Rivera replied, surprising everyone with the hint of a smile. "You see, I took the liberty of researching your company more thoroughly. Specifically, I looked into your public statements about worker safety at Stone Innovations." She lifted a printed page. "Here's a quote from you in Business Today magazine just 3 months ago. 'The safety of our workers is my top priority. I personally inspect every factory floor at least twice a year and have implemented the highest safety standards in the industry.'" She looked up. "Is that an accurate quote, Mr. Stone?" Alexander shifted in his seat. "Yes, that sounds right." "Interesting," Judge Rivera continued, "because I also have here travel records submitted by your company for tax purposes over the past 5 years. She held up another document. "According to these records, you haven't visited any of your manufacturing facilities in North America since they opened. Not once." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Alexander's jaw tightened as he glanced at Diane, who looked as surprised as he was. "Furthermore," Judge Rivera continued, "I have inspection reports from OSHA showing that your factories have been cited for safety violations 27 times in the past 3 years alone, far more than any of your competitors." She set the papers down and looked directly at Alexander. "So it seems your public statements about prioritizing worker safety were, to put it plainly, lies." Alexander finally stood up, his face flushing with anger. "Your Honor, my company employs thousands of people. I can't personally oversee every detail of operations. That's why I have managers. Managers who testified that they were acting under your direct orders to cut safety measures to increase profits." Judge Rivera interrupted. "Mr. Stone, you've demonstrated not only contempt for this court, but contempt for the law and for the well-being of the people who built your fortune." She leaned forward. "In light of your behavior and the evidence before me, I've decided on an unusual response to your contempt charge." The courtroom fell silent. Even Alexander seemed to sense that something unprecedented was about to happen. "You claim ignorance of conditions in your factories," Judge Rivera said. "You suggest that safety isn't your responsibility despite public claims to the contrary. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to learn firsthand what your workers experience." She picked up a document and read from it. Alexander Stone, instead of traditional contempt penalties, this court sentences you to work for 2 weeks as an entry-level employee at your own Westside manufacturing facility, beginning tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Gasps filled the courtroom. Alexander's mouth fell open in shock. During this time, the judge continued, you will perform the same tasks as regular workers, follow the same schedule, live on the same wages, and stay in company housing. You will use your legal name but will not reveal your identity as the company owner. You will be fitted with a court-approved tracking device to ensure compliance. Alexander found his voice. This is outrageous. You can't possibly. I can and I am. Judge Rivera cut him off. This is entirely within my discretion as a judge when addressing contempt. Your alternative is 30 days in county jail and a $50,000 fine for each count of contempt, which currently stands at 3. That's 90 days and $150,000. Diane stood up. Your Honor, while we respect the court's authority, this is a highly unusual punishment that may interfere with Mr. Stone's responsibilities as CEO of a major corporation. Ms. Powell, your client has repeatedly claimed that worker safety is his top priority, while demonstrating complete ignorance of actual conditions. I'm giving him the opportunity to reconcile that contradiction. Judge Rivera looked at Alexander. Mr. Stone, what will it be? 2 weeks working in your factory or 90 days in jail? Alexander's face had turned an alarming shade of red. For a moment it seemed he might explode with rage, but Diane placed a warning hand on his arm. He took a deep breath, visibly struggling to control himself. Fine, he spat. 2 weeks. Judge Rivera nodded. Wise choice. The court will arrange for a probation officer to fit you with an ankle monitor this afternoon. You'll report to the Westside Facility Personnel Office tomorrow at 6 a.m., where you'll be assigned to the production line. You'll receive standard, entry-level pay and be housed in the company dormitory for workers who can't afford local rent prices. She turned to the bailiff. Please ensure that Mr. Stone understands he is not to contact any of his executives or managers during this period. He is to experience factory life exactly as his workers do. Alexander stood rigidly, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Those who knew him well could see he was barely containing his fury. Additionally, Judge Rivera continued, court-appointed, observers will be placed in the facility, unidentified to prevent special treatment, to monitor both Mr. Stone's compliance and the working conditions. Any attempt to receive preferential treatment or to reveal your identity will result in the jail sentence being imposed immediately. She looked around the courtroom. This court will reconvene in 2 weeks to hear Mr. Stone's account of his experience and to continue with these proceedings. Until then, this case is in recess. With a final crack of her gavel, Judge Rivera stood and exited the courtroom. The moment she was gone, Alexander turned on Diane. Fix this, he hissed through clenched teeth. I don't care what it costs or what you have to do. I am not working in a factory. There's nothing I can do right now, Diane whispered back urgently. If you fight this, you'll go to jail, which would be even worse for the company's stock price. 2 weeks will pass quickly and we can use the time to prepare a better defense. 2 weeks? Alexander sputtered. Do you have any idea what I had scheduled for the next 2 weeks? The Singapore merger, the board meeting, the technology summit in Tokyo. All of which can be postponed, Diane insisted. Alex, listen to me. This judge has public opinion on her side. Fighting her will only make things worse. Take the 2 weeks, let this blow over, then we'll counterattack. Across the courtroom, the plaintiffs and their supporters were reacting with stunned disbelief that gradually transformed into cautious satisfaction. Robert Chen, the worker who had lost 3 fingers, caught Alexander's eye and nodded slowly, a gesture that seemed to say, now you'll see. Reporters were already rushing from the courtroom to break the news. By morning, Alexander Stone's sentence would be headline news across the country. The arrogant billionaire forced to work on his own factory floor. Later that afternoon, a stone-faced Alexander sat in a probation office as a court officer attached a tracking device to his ankle. This is waterproof but not damage-proof, the officer explained. Any attempt to remove it will trigger an immediate alert and result in your arrest. Alexander said nothing, his mind racing as he tried to figure, out a way to turn this humiliation to his advantage. There had to be an angle, some way to manipulate the situation. You'll need to pack for 2 weeks, the officer continued, handing him a sheet of paper. Here's what's allowed in the worker dormitory. No electronic devices except a basic phone. That will provide. No credit cards, no luxury items. Alexander scanned the list with growing horror. 1 suitcase, 2 pairs of shoes, this is insane. That's more than many of your workers bring, the officer replied without sympathy. The dormitory rooms are small, and most of your employees can't afford much anyway. You'll be paid exactly what they make, $14.25 an hour, minus taxes and the housing fee that's automatically deducted from their pay. For the first time, Alexander felt a flicker of genuine apprehension. He'd grown up wealthy, attended elite schools, and had never in his life done manual labor or gone without luxury. The prospect of 2 weeks living like his lowest-paid workers was more terrifying to him than he wanted to admit. "What about my security team?" he asked. "I receive death threats regularly. I can't just—" "The court has arranged for discreet security," the officer cut in. "But they won't interfere with your work experience or provide any comforts. Their only job is to prevent actual harm." That night, in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, Alexander paced restlessly. He'd tried calling his top executives to arrange some way around the judge's order, only to discover that his accounts had been temporarily frozen and his phones were being monitored. Somehow, Judge Rivera had anticipated his every move. As he reluctantly packed a small suitcase with items from the approved list, leaving behind his designer clothes and custom shoes, Alexander promised himself that once this ordeal was over, he would make everyone involved pay. He'd find a way to ruin Judge Rivera's career. He'd fire every worker who had testified against him. He'd show them all who really had the power. What Alexander couldn't know was that his 2 weeks in the factory would change him in ways he couldn't imagine, and that the real shock was yet to come. The factory loomed like a gray fortress against the dawn sky as Alexander Stone approached the entrance, dressed in ordinary jeans and a plain button-up shirt that felt foreign against his skin. He'd been dropped off by a court officer in an unmarked car, carrying only the small suitcase of approved items. The ankle monitor felt heavy and unfamiliar, a constant reminder of his humiliation. At precisely 6 a.m., he pushed through the employee entrance, stepping into a world he owned but had never truly seen. The personnel office was a cramped room with flickering fluorescent lights and peeling paint, nothing like the sleek executive floors of his corporate headquarters. "You must be the new guy," said a tired-looking woman behind the desk. "Alex? Stone, right?" He nodded stiffly, wondering if she knew who he really was. Her bored expression suggested not. "Fill these out." She pushed a stack of forms across the desk. "Benefits don't kick in for 90 days, so don't get sick before then." She smiled briefly at her own joke. Alexander sat in a plastic chair that creaked under his weight and began filling out paperwork about himself for a company he owned. The irony wasn't lost on him. An hour later, he stood in a line of other new hires, mostly people half his age, looking either nervous or resigned. A man in a worn blue uniform approached. "I'm Frank, your floor supervisor," he announced without warmth. "Follow me for orientation and training." They were led through a maze of corridors until they reached the main production floor. The moment the heavy doors opened, Alexander was assaulted by noise, the relentless clanging of machinery, hissing of pneumatic tools, and whirring of conveyor belts. The air smelled of hot metal and industrial chemicals. Frank shouted to be heard over the din. "This is where we assemble the S12 components for Stone Innovation's flagship products. You'll be trained on Station 7, the precision joining section." Alexander followed, trying to maintain his dignity while stepping around puddles of unknown liquids. He noticed workers glancing at him, the oldest new hire by far, with mild curiosity before returning to their tasks. "Here's your station," Frank said, pointing to a metal table covered with tools and tiny components. "Antonio will train you. Bathroom breaks are 10 minutes max, lunch is 30 minutes at noon. Quotas are posted daily. Fail to meet them 3 times and you're out." With that, Frank walked away, already focused on some other problem down the line. Antonio, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and deep lines around his eyes, nodded at Alexander. "First time in a factory?" "Is it that obvious?" Alexander asked. Antonio smiled slightly. "Your hands, no calluses." He pointed to a stool. "Sit. I'll show you what to do." For the next hour, Alexander struggled to follow Antonio's instructions on how to attach minuscule components to circuit boards. Each piece required precise alignment under a magnifying glass. His fingers, more accustomed to signing contracts than manipulative work, felt clumsy and stiff. "Too slow," Antonio said, checking Alexander's first completed board. "You need to finish one every 3 minutes to meet quota." "That's impossible," Alexander protested. Antonio shrugged. "I do one every 2 minutes and I'm considered average. Practice more." He demonstrated again, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. By mid-morning, Alexander's back ached from hunching over the workstation, his eyes burned from straining through the magnifier, and his fingers were cramping. When he tried to stand and stretch, a nearby supervisor barked, "No standing unless you're meeting quota, new guy." At noon, a bell rang, and workers immediately set down their tools and moved toward the cafeteria. Alexander followed, his legs stiff and painful. The cafeteria was nothing like the gourmet dining room at his corporate headquarters. Here, workers stood in line for prepackaged sandwiches and coffee from ancient urns. Alexander joined the line, shocked at the $8.50 price tag for a basic ham sandwich and small coffee, nearly an hour's wages after taxes. He found an empty seat at the end of a table and unwrapped his sandwich, trying not to think about the 5-star restaurants where he usually dined. Nearby, workers talked in low voices, most looking too tired for much conversation. "Mind if I sit?" a voice asked. Alexander looked up to see a young woman with weary eyes but a friendly smile. "Go ahead," he replied, secretly grateful for the company. "I'm Lily," she said, settling across from him with a container of what looked like homemade rice and beans. "You're new, right? I saw you at Antonio's station." "Alex," he replied, using only his first name as instructed by the court. "First day." Lily nodded sympathetically. "The first week is the hardest. Your body needs time to adjust." She gestured to his sandwich. "You should bring food from home if you can. Cafeteria prices will eat your whole paycheck." Alexander looked at his half-eaten sandwich with new understanding. If a simple lunch cost an hour's wages, how did his workers afford to eat daily? "Do you live in the dormitory?" Lily asked. He nodded, remembering he was supposed to check in there after his shift. "Me too," she said. "Been there 3 years, saving for my own place, but rent around here." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Anyway, dormitory's not so bad, just loud." When lunch ended, Alexander returned to his workstation, his sandwich sitting heavily in his stomach. The afternoon stretched endlessly before him as he struggled to increase his pace. By the 4 o'clock mark, his quota sheet showed he'd completed only 60% of his expected output. Frank appeared at his station. "Not good enough, Stone. If you can't handle this station, we'll move you to heavy assembly tomorrow." "I'll get faster," Alexander promised, surprising himself with how much he wanted to avoid being moved to an even more physically demanding position. "See that you do," Frank replied, making a note on his clipboard. By the time the shift ended at 6, Alexander's entire body ached. He'd never experienced this kind of physical fatigue. His lower back throbbed, his shoulders felt like they were on fire, and his fingers were numb from the repetitive movements. He followed a group of workers to the dormitory, a 5-story building, a few blocks from the factory. Inside, the lobby was bare except for a security desk manned by a guard who barely looked up from his phone as workers filed past. "Name?" the guard asked when Alexander approached. "Alexander Stone." The guard checked. "A list. Room 312, 3rd floor, shared with Vicente Lopez. Here's your key. No alcohol, no overnight guests, quiet hours 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. Alexander took the key and headed for the elevator, only to find a handwritten out-of-order sign taped to the doors. With a sigh, he turned to the stairs, his legs protesting each step. Room 312 was approximately the size of his master bathroom at home. 2 twin beds with thin mattresses occupied most of the space. with a small dresser between them. A door led to a bathroom that Alexander discovered he would be sharing not just with his roommate, but with the occupants of room 314 as well. He set his suitcase on the unclaimed bed and sank down beside it, too exhausted to even unpack. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. For the next 13 days, this would be his life: endless physical labor, meager food, cramped living quarters, and constant supervision. His roommate Vicente arrived an hour later, a quiet man in his 50s who merely nodded at Alexander before heating a can of soup on a hot plate that didn't look entirely legal in the dormitory setting. "You want some?" Vicente offered, gesturing to the soup. Touched by the unexpected kindness, Alexander nodded. They ate in silence, sitting on their respective beds. "First day?" Vicente finally asked, noticing how Alexander winced when he moved. "Is it obvious?" Vicente almost smiled. "It gets easier. Your body adjusts." He reached into his dresser and tossed Alexander a bottle of pain relievers. "Take 2 now, 2 in the morning." "Thanks," Alexander said, genuinely grateful. That night, lying on the lumpy mattress, listening to Vicente's soft snoring and the sounds of arguments and television from neighboring rooms, Alexander stared at the ceiling. For the first time in years, he thought about his early days building stone innovations, the excitement, the purpose, the sense that he was creating something meaningful. Somewhere along the way, that purpose had gotten lost. His company had become nothing but numbers on spreadsheets, stock values, and quarterly reports. The actual people who built his products had become invisible to him. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, Alexander wondered how many of his workers took pain relievers every night just to prepare for the next day's labor. The next morning arrived with the harsh buzz of Vicente's alarm at 5 a.m. Alexander groaned, every muscle in his body protesting as he forced himself to sit up. "Shower now if you want hot water," Vicente advised. "Gets cold by 5:30 when everyone's using it." Alexander shuffled to the shared bathroom, wincing with each step. As he stood under the lukewarm spray, he found himself thinking about the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, people like Robert Chen and Alicia Patel, who had endured these conditions for years while suffering injuries and illness. For the first time, a small seed of doubt crept into his mind. Had he been wrong about them? Were they really just lazy workers looking for a payday, as he'd claimed in court? Or were they people who had legitimate grievances against a company, his company, that had treated them as disposable? These uncomfortable thoughts followed him as he walked back to the factory in the pre-dawn darkness, joining the stream of workers heading to another day of grueling labor. Somewhere among them, he knew, were the court's observers, watching to ensure he fulfilled the terms of his sentence. What Alexander didn't realize was that the most difficult test of his sentence was yet to come, a test that would force him to make a choice between the man he had been and the man he might become. 1 week into his sentence, Alexander had settled into an exhausting routine. His body, though still aching at the end of each day, had begun to adjust to the physical demands of factory work. His hands now bore small calluses, and he'd gotten faster at assembling the components, nearly meeting his daily quota. What hadn't gotten easier was witnessing the conditions his workers endured. Each day brought new revelations that chipped away at his previous worldview. On Monday, he'd watched as Lily, who had become something of a friend, was denied time off to care for her sick child because she'd already used her limited sick days, when she herself had caught the flu a month earlier. On Tuesday, he'd noticed Antonio wrapping his wrist with a makeshift brace, grimacing in pain but continuing to work. "Repetitive strain," Antonio had explained with a shrug. "Can't afford to see a doctor until insurance kicks in." On Wednesday, Alexander had discovered the break room's first aid kit was nearly empty, with expired supplies and missing essential items. When he'd mentioned this to Frank, the supervisor had sighed. "We've been requesting a restock for months. Budget cuts." By Thursday, Alexander found himself thinking less about his own discomfort and more about the people around him. People who endured these conditions not for 2 weeks, but year after year, He was in the cafeteria on Friday sharing lunch with Lily and Vicente when the accident happened. A crash echoed from the production floor, followed by screams. Everyone froze, then rushed toward the sound. Alexander followed, heart pounding. In the heavy assembly area, a section of shelving had collapsed, sending metal components raining down on the workers below. One man lay on the floor, blood pooling around his head, while two others were trying to free a young woman whose leg was pinned under fallen equipment. "Someone call an ambulance!" a worker shouted. Frank appeared, his face pale. "Everyone back, to work except emergency team members," he ordered, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Alexander stared at the collapsed shelving, recognition dawning. The metal supports were bent and rusted, clearly inadequate for the weight they'd been bearing. Worse, he could see where makeshift repairs had been attempted with duct tape and wire. "This shouldn't have happened," he said aloud, drawing a few glances. An older worker standing nearby snorted. "We've been reporting these shelves as unsafe for months. Maintenance keeps saying it's scheduled for repair, but nothing happens." Alexander felt sick. He knew exactly why nothing had happened. 3 quarters ago, he'd personally approved a 30% cut to maintenance budgets across all factories to boost quarterly profits ahead of a major investor meeting. The injured man was carefully moved onto a stretcher as they waited for the ambulance. Alexander recognized him as Pavel, a quiet worker from the dormitory's 2nd floor. The young woman, finally freed from under the equipment, sobbed in pain as someone fashioned a makeshift splint for her obviously broken leg. "Will they be okay?" Alexander asked Lily, who had appeared at his side. "Physically? Maybe. Financially?" She shook her head. "They'll both miss work, and our health insurance has a massive deductible. Most of us are one accident away from bankruptcy." The ambulance finally arrived, and as Pavel was being loaded in, his eyes briefly met Alexander's. There was no recognition there, just pain and fear, but Alexander felt the connection like a physical blow. That could have been anyone. It could have been Lily or Vicente or Antonio. It could have been him. Back in his dormitory room that night, Alexander couldn't sleep. The image of Pavel's bloodied face kept appearing in his mind. He'd caused this, not directly, but through decisions made in plush boardrooms, far removed from their consequences. "You're still awake," Vicente observed, his voice quiet in the darkness. "I can't stop thinking about the accident," Alexander admitted. Vicente was silent for a moment. "This wasn't the first. Won't be the last either." "Doesn't that make you angry?" Alexander asked. "What good would it do? We need the jobs, company knows it." The resignation in Vicente's voice haunted Alexander throughout the weekend. By Monday morning, he'd made a decision. During his lunch break, he approached Frank. "I need to report a safety concern," he said firmly. Frank looked tired. "Fill out a form. I'll submit it with the others." "The others? How many reports are there?" Frank shrugged. "Dozens. They go to headquarters, but nothing happens. Budget cuts." "What if I could help?" Alexander asked carefully. "I have some experience with workplace safety regulations." Frank studied him for a moment. "Look, I appreciate the initiative, but unless you know the CEO personally, nothing's going to change." The irony of the statement almost made Alexander laugh. Instead, he nodded seriously. "Let me try anyway. What's the most urgent safety issue besides those shelves?" To his surprise, Frank actually seemed to consider the question. "Ventilation in the chemical area. The system breaks down weekly, but they just keep patching it instead of replacing it. The same area where Alicia Patel worked," Alexander murmured, remembering her testimony. "You knew Alicia?" Frank asked, surprised. "I heard about her case," Alexander said carefully. "She's part of the lawsuit, right?" Frank nodded. "She got the worst of it, but at least 20 people from that section have developed breathing problems. Good workers, too." That afternoon, Alexander took his first deliberate risk of breaking the judge's rules. During a bathroom break, he used the basic phone provided by the court to call Diane. "It's me," he said when she answered. "Alex, why are you calling? You know this could violate—" "Listen to me," he cut in. I need you to do something, and it can't wait 2 more days until I'm back. What is it? Her voice was cautious. Call Carson in operations. Tell him to immediately approve the maintenance request for Factory 12, especially the ventilation system in chemical processing and the shelving in heavy assembly. Someone could die, Diane. There was silence on the other end. Alex, are you okay? This doesn't sound like you. I've seen things, he said simply. Just do it. Use the emergency fund if you have to. The board will ask questions, the shareholders. I don't care, Alexander said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Just fix it. The next day, maintenance teams arrived at the factory. Workers watched in amazement as the damaged shelving was completely replaced and work began on the ventilation system. Rumors spread quickly that someone high up had finally listened. Alexander kept his head down, saying nothing, but inside he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with stock prices. On his final day at the factory, Alexander worked alongside Antonio, their movements now almost in sync as they assembled components. You got good at this, Antonio remarked. Fast learner. I had a good teacher, Alexander replied. What you do here, it matters. All of you. You're the real heart of the company, not the executives in the glass tower. Antonio gave him a curious look. Strange thing for a new guy to say. Alexander just smiled. The next morning, Alexander Stone walked into Judge Rivera's courtroom a different man than the one who had left it 2 weeks earlier. His designer suit hung slightly loose on his frame, which had lost its softness. His hands bore calluses, and a small cut across his forearm was still healing, a souvenir from the assembly line. This time, when Judge Rivera entered, Alexander was the first to rise, standing tall with genuine respect. The judge noticed immediately, a slight smile touching her lips as she took her seat. Welcome back, Mr. Stone. I trust your experience was educational. More than you know, Your Honor, Alexander replied. The courtroom was packed. The plaintiffs sat together, watching him warily. News of his factory sentence had made national headlines, and reporters filled the back rows, eager to see the outcome. Before we continue with the case, Judge Rivera said, I'd like to hear your thoughts on your experience, Mr. Stone. Alexander took a deep breath and moved to the center of the courtroom. 2 weeks ago, I walked into this courtroom believing that I was above the law, above common courtesy, and certainly above the people who work in my factories. He turned to face the plaintiffs. I was wrong, profoundly wrong. I've spent the past 2 weeks working alongside people like you, experiencing the conditions I created through my decisions. I've felt the physical pain of repetitive work without proper equipment. I've seen the fear when someone gets hurt and knows they can't afford to miss work. His voice grew stronger. Yesterday, I witnessed the installation of new safety equipment that should have been there years ago. That's just the beginning of the changes I intend to make. He turned back to Judge Rivera. Your Honor, I'd like to address the plaintiffs directly, if I may. The judge nodded her permission. Alexander faced Robert, Alicia, and the others. No apology can restore what you've lost. Fingers, health, years of your lives. But I can tell you this. Your lawsuit has achieved its purpose. Not through legal penalties, but by forcing me to see the human cost of my decisions. He took another deep breath. I'm prepared to offer a settlement that includes not just financial compensation for your injuries, but comprehensive changes to working conditions in all Stone Innovations facilities. Murmurs swept through the courtroom as Alexander outlined his proposal. Full medical coverage for all injured workers and their families, retroactive hazard pay, improved safety measures across all factories, and the establishment of a worker-led safety committee with real authority. Additionally, he concluded, I'm creating a $50 million fund for employees who've suffered health effects from unsafe conditions, whether they're part of this lawsuit or not. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Rivera studied him for a long moment. Mr. Stone, she finally said, are these genuine offers you're prepared to implement immediately? Yes, Your Honor. The paperwork is already being drawn up. She turned to the plaintiff's attorney. Mr. Washington, do your clients wish to consider this offer? Thomas Washington conferred briefly with his clients, though their shocked expressions suggested they already had an answer. We do, Your Honor, Washington replied, and we'd like to work with Mr. Stone to ensure these changes are properly implemented. Judge Rivera nodded. Then we'll recess to allow formal settlement discussions. Mr. Stone, it seems my unorthodox sentence achieved its purpose. It did more than that, Your Honor, Alexander said quietly. It reminded me why I started this company, in the first place, to make things that improve people's lives, including the lives of those who build them. As he returned to his seat, Alexander caught sight of Diane's stunned expression. The financial cost of his proposed settlement would be enormous, the shareholders would be furious, and the business press would call him crazy. But for the first time in years, Alexander Stone felt like he was standing on solid ground. 2 weeks in his own factory had taught him what a decade in the executive suite had not. That true wealth wasn't measured in stock options or quarterly reports, but in the lives of the people who made it all possible. And when the gavel fell, to close that day's session, everyone in the courtroom, including Alexander Stone, rose together.